In today's video, we'll be discussing the top 15 countries where Christians face severe restrictions and are not welcome in 2024. Around the world, millions of people are denied the right to freely practice their faith, and in some places, simply identifying as a Christian can lead to discrimination, violence, imprisonment, or even death. While religious freedom is a fundamental human right, it's a privilege not enjoyed by everyone. From authoritarian regimes to extremist-controlled regions, Christians in these countries must navigate a hostile environment, often forced to worship in secret or risk their lives for their beliefs. Join us as we take a closer look at these nations, uncovering the challenges Christians face and why it's so dangerous to practice their faith in these regions. 15. Turkey. Turkey has a complex history with Christianity, being home to some of the earliest Christian communities. However, in recent years, the environment for Christians has become increasingly hostile, particularly under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's administration. Although the Turkish constitution guarantees freedom of religion, Christians often face societal discrimination, bureaucratic hurdles, and occasional violence. The government exerts significant control over religious institutions, and many churches struggle with property rights issues, including confiscation of church properties. Converts from Islam to Christianity frequently encounter familial rejection and societal hostility, sometimes leading to threats or violence. While Turkey is home to diverse Christian communities, including Orthodox and Protestant denominations, the climate of intolerance and government restrictions make it challenging for Christians to practice their faith freely. 14. Comoros. Comoros is a small island nation in the Indian Ocean where Islam is the dominant religion, and the constitution establishes Islam as the state religion. In this predominantly Muslim context, Christians, especially those who have converted from Islam, often face significant social pressure and hostility. While there is a small Christian population, they are largely marginalized, and converts can be subject to severe repercussions from family and local communities, including threats, harassment, and violence. The government enforces a policy of religious conformity, limiting the ability of Christians to practice their faith openly. As a result, many Christians are forced to worship in secret or practice their faith discreetly to avoid backlash. There is little legal protection for religious minorities, and any attempts to proselytize or openly express Christian beliefs can lead to social ostracism and persecution. 13. Indonesia. Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim-majority country, has a history of religious tolerance, but Christians still face significant challenges. While the constitution guarantees freedom of religion and practice, Christians often experience discrimination and violence, particularly in regions with a strong Islamist presence. There have been reports of church closures, harassment, and violent attacks against Christian communities. In some areas, local authorities impose restrictions on church construction and activities, citing concerns from Muslim neighbors. Religious intolerance has been on the rise, with extremist groups targeting Christians and other religious minorities. Despite these challenges, many Christians continue to practice their faith and advocate for their rights within a complex and sometimes hostile environment. 12. Malaysia. In Malaysia, Islam is the state religion, and Christians face significant legal and social challenges. While the country has a relatively diverse population, the government imposes restrictions on religious practices, particularly for Christians. The constitution provides for freedom of religion, but in practice, converts from Islam often face severe penalties, including social ostracism and violence. The government enforces Islamic laws that restrict the use of the word Allah by non-Muslims, leading to tensions between religious communities. Discrimination against Christians is common, and they may encounter barriers in accessing education, employment, and government services. While there are active Christian communities in Malaysia, the legal and social environment makes it difficult for them to practice their faith openly. 11. Nigeria. Nigeria faces a complex religious landscape, with Christians in the northern regions experiencing severe persecution from Islamist militant groups such as Boko Haram and ISIS affiliates. These groups target Christian communities for attacks, including bombings, kidnappings, and massacres, often with impunity. Christians in the Middle Belt region also face violence from herdsmen who are primarily Muslim. The Nigerian government has struggled to protect Christians from these violent groups, leading to widespread fear and displacement. In addition to physical threats, Christians often face discrimination and restrictions on their religious practices. The situation is compounded by social tensions and ethnic conflicts, making Nigeria one of the most dangerous countries for Christians in Africa. 10. Eritrea. Eritrea is known for its severe repression of religious freedom, with Christians facing intense persecution from the government. The regime, led by President Isaias Afwerki, does not officially recognize many Christian denominations, leading to the arrest and imprisonment of thousands of believers. Those caught worshiping outside of state-sanctioned churches can be detained in harsh conditions, often without trial. The government's intolerance extends to both Protestant and Orthodox Christians, leading to widespread fear among believers. Reports of torture and abuse in detention facilities are common, and many Christians are forced to flee the country to escape persecution. The atmosphere of fear and repression makes Eritrea one of the most challenging environments for Christians in the world. 9. Sudan. In Sudan, Christians have faced decades of persecution, particularly during and after the civil wars that led to the country's division in 2011. While the new government has taken some steps towards religious freedom, deep-seated discrimination against Christians remains prevalent. The Sudanese government historically promoted an Islamic identity, leading to systematic discrimination against religious minorities. Christians often encounter obstacles in practicing their faith, including harassment and restrictions on building churches. Apostasy from Islam can lead to severe penalties, and many Christians live in fear of social ostracism or violence. Despite these challenges, Sudan's Christian community remains resilient, continuing to advocate for their rights and seek greater religious freedom. 8. Central African Republic. The Central African Republic has been embroiled in conflict for years, with violence often rooted in religious differences between Christians and Muslims. While the country has a significant Christian population, the rise of militia groups, such as the Salika and Anti-Balaka, has led to widespread violence against both Christians and Muslims. Christians in CAR face threats from these militias, and many have been displaced from their homes due to the ongoing violence. The fragile security situation makes it difficult for Christians to worship freely, and there are frequent reports of attacks on churches and congregations. Humanitarian aid is limited, and many Christian communities are in desperate need of support and protection as they navigate the dangers of living in a conflict zone. 7. Syria. Syria has been deeply affected by civil war, and Christians have faced significant challenges in this context. Although Syria has a long history of Christian communities, the ongoing conflict has made their situation precarious. Various militant groups, including ISIS and al-Nusra Front, have targeted Christians, leading to violence, displacement, and forced conversions. Many Christians have fled the country, seeking refuge in safer nations, while those who remain often live in fear of persecution. The Syrian government has been known to use Christian communities for political purposes, creating a complicated relationship where Christians may be tolerated but are still vulnerable to attacks from extremist groups. The destruction of churches and Christian heritage sites during the conflict has further threatened the survival of these communities. 6. Yemen. The ongoing conflict in Yemen has created a humanitarian crisis, and Christians find themselves in a particularly vulnerable position amid the chaos. The country is predominantly Muslim, and Christians face discrimination, hostility, and violence from both state and non-state actors, including Houthi rebels who enforce a strict interpretation of Islamic law. Conversion from Islam to Christianity can lead to severe penalties, including death. The war has exacerbated the suffering of Christians, as access to humanitarian aid is limited, and those who practice their faith openly are often targeted for persecution. Many Christians in Yemen live in hiding or practice their faith in secret to avoid violence and retribution. The lack of security and ongoing conflict further complicate the lives of religious minorities in the country. 5. Iran. Iran is a predominantly Shia Muslim country where religious freedom is heavily restricted, and Christians, particularly converts from Islam, face severe persecution. The Iranian government views Christianity as a threat to the Islamic Republic's ideological foundations, leading to systematic crackdowns on religious activities. House churches, informal gatherings where Christians worship, are frequently raided by authorities, and members can be arrested, tortured, or imprisoned. Converts to Christianity often face familial and societal rejection, and their faith may be met with hostility. The government employs various tactics to monitor and control religious practices, and the atmosphere of fear discourages open expressions of faith. While there are some officially recognized Christian communities, they are subject to strict government regulations and limitations on their activities. 4. Pakistan. In Pakistan, Christians face systemic discrimination and violence, particularly due to the country's blasphemy laws, which are often misused to target religious minorities. Under these laws, anyone accused of insulting Islam or its prophet can face severe penalties, including death, and accusations are frequently made against Christians as a means of settling personal grievances. The social atmosphere is charged with intolerance, and Christians often encounter hostility and discrimination in their daily lives. from access to employment and education to social interactions. In rural areas, Christians may face mob violence or forced conversions. Churches are sometimes targeted by extremists, leading to bombings and attacks. The Pakistani government has been criticized for its failure to protect Christians and other religious minorities, allowing a culture of impunity for those who commit violence against them. 3. Somalia. Somalia is one of the most hostile environments for Christians in the world, primarily due to its dominant Islamic culture and the influence of militant groups like Al-Shabaab, which enforces a strict interpretation of Islamic law. Christianity is viewed as a foreign religion, and converts from Islam face severe persecution, including threats of violence, imprisonment, or even death. The country has no recognized churches, and any attempt to practice Christianity openly can result in violent reprisals. In rural areas, especially, the presence of Al-Shabaab creates a climate of fear, as the group actively targets Christians and anyone suspected of collaborating with Western influences. Christians must practice their faith in extreme secrecy, and the lack of religious freedom in Somalia leaves little room for hope of improvement in the near future. 2. Afghanistan. Since the Taliban regained control of Afghanistan in August 2021, the situation for Christians has deteriorated dramatically. Under the Taliban's strict interpretation of Islamic law, conversion from Islam to Christianity is considered apostasy, punishable by death. This puts Afghan Christians, especially converts, at significant risk, as they face threats not only from the Taliban but also from their families and communities, which may view their conversion as a betrayal. Many Christians are forced to live in hiding, often changing locations frequently to avoid detection. The lack of a legal framework to protect religious minorities exacerbates their vulnerability, leaving them with no safe spaces to worship or express their beliefs. The Taliban's ongoing crackdown on dissent also extends to any forms of religious expression outside of their interpretation of Islam, further isolating and endangering Christians in the country. 1. North Korea. North Korea is notorious for being one of the most oppressive countries in the world regarding religious freedom, particularly for Christians. The regime, led by Kim Jong-un, perceives Christianity as a direct threat to its authority and the state's ideology, which revolves around a personality cult centered on the ruling family. The country enforces a policy of state atheism, and any form of religious practice is met with severe repression. Christians must worship in absolute secrecy, as being caught with a Bible or participating in underground church gatherings can result in extreme punishments, including imprisonment in labor camps, torture, or execution. Reports indicate that entire families can be imprisoned for the religious activities of a single member, creating an atmosphere of fear and distrust among believers. Despite the risks, some Christians attempt to meet in secret, but the consequences of discovery are dire, making it nearly impossible to practice their faith openly.